Hey students, Mr. Tracy here. Going to read through the poem Oranges with You by Gary Soto. I'll read the poem. We'll do maybe some analysis kind of together, ask some questions that you can kind of think about. As I read through the poem, you can think about some of the skills that we said we'd focus on while we were reading this poem. This is what the poem probably looked like when Gary Soto wrote it or published it, in a linear format, but it's pretty difficult for me to read it here or to see it on my slide when the font is so small. So I put it into three columns here for us. Not as visually appealing, perhaps, but now it's on one screen and I can read the whole poem over. Remember, this is a free verse poem. We can also consider this a narrative poem because it's telling a story. As I read, you want to be kind of thinking about what the narrative, what the story is, the characters, the setting, the figurative language, and also kind of let Gary Soto's imagery create a visual image in your mind. So I'm going to read the poem through. The first time I walked with a girl, I was 12, cold and weighted down, with two oranges in my jacket. December, frost crackling beneath my steps, my breath before me, then gone. As I walked toward her house, the one whose porch light burned yellow night and day in any weather, a dog barked at me until she came out, pulling at her gloves, face bright with rouge. I smiled, touched her shoulder, and led her down the street, across a used car lot and a line of newly painted trees, until we were breathing before a drugstore. We entered, the tiny bell bringing a saleslady down a narrow aisle of goods. I turned to the candies, tiered like bleachers, and asked what she wanted. Light in her eyes, a smile starting at the corners of her mouth. I fingered a nickel in my pocket, and when she lifted a chocolate that cost a dime, I didn't say anything. I took the nickel from my pocket, then an orange, set them quietly on the counter. When I looked up, the lady's eyes met mine and held them, knowing very well what it was all about. Outside, a few cars hissing past, fog hanging like old coats between the trees. I took my girl's hand in mine for 2 blocks, then released it to let her unwrap the chocolate. I peeled my orange that was so bright against the gray of December that from some distance someone might have thought I was making a fire in my hands. So that's the whole poem there. And you certainly could pause the video here and go back over and read it again one or two times. Poetry certainly it often deserves a second, third, or even fourth kind of read or look. So you're welcome to do that. But I'm going to go ahead and go to the next slide. And we're going to kind of take the poem in some sections and kind of look at it together. So we get the beginning here, and I'm just going to read these first 20 lines, and then let's go through them a little bit. The first time I walked with a girl, I was 12, cold and weighted down with two oranges in my jacket. December, frost crackling beneath my steps, my breath before me, then gone. As I walked toward her house, the one whose porch light burned yellow night and day in any weather, a dog barked at me until she came out pulling at her gloves, face bright with rouge. I smiled, touched her shoulder, and led her down the street, across a used car lot in a line of newly planted trees. So at the beginning, we have characterization. So can you notice the characterization here? What can you determine about our two characters? What are their thoughts and feelings? It starts out, the first time I walked with a girl, I was 12. This is a looking back. The narrator is reflecting back on this time in his life, and we can make the inference that it isn't the first time he's ever talked to a girl or walked next to a girl, but this is a girl that he's interested in. This is kind of like a first date. The description of the setting, I think, is important in this story too. We see the word December and frost crackling beneath his steps, his breath before him, then gone. I can visualize that when it's cold outside and you can see your breath and that kind of fog, and then it just sort of disappears. The characterization too continues on, and we can tell that the boy is a little nervous. I'm also wondering about the boy with the characterization. I don't know about you, but the first time I read it, why in the world would he have two oranges in his pocket? It doesn't seem like you'd want to stuff these two large oranges in your jacket. But it made me think that he's planning on taking those oranges out. He's got two of them, one for her and one for him. So I think he's kind of planning on maybe sharing an orange with her on this date. Here we get to the figurative language. Gary Soda's a little tricky. I didn't notice it the first time. I kind of bolded the words here I wanted you to look at. But the first time I walked with the girl, I was 12, cold and weighted down with two oranges. What type of figurative language is that? That repetition. There's a similar one where he does, oh, I got to find it. It's kind of uh, B's and M's. So beneath my, so we have B and M word, and then my breath before me. So we have this kind of repetition of words with B's and M's in these two lines here. But what is the figurative language here? Got a second question for you. This goes up kind of towards line 5, where it says, December, frost cracking beneath my steps. What is that cracking? What type of figurative language is that? All right, I'm going to continue the poem. I'm actually going to continue at line 20. So it says they're a used car lot and a line of newly planted trees until we were breathing before a drugstore. We entered, the tiny bell bringing a saleslady down a narrow aisle of goods. I turned to the candies, tiered like bleachers, and asked what she wanted. Light in her eyes, a smile starting at the corners of her mouth. I fingered a nickel in my pocket, and when she lifted a chocolate that cost a dime, I didn't say anything. I took the nickel from my pocket, then an orange, then set them quietly on the counter. When I looked up, the lady's eyes met mine and held them knowingly, very well what it was all about. So let's take a look at this one here. I have kind of an arrow there. This is the big moment. He takes her to this drugstore or this kind of corner store, and they're picking out candy, and he only has a nickel in his pocket. And she picks out a chocolate that costs 10 cents. And how does the sales lady save the day? Why do you think the author remembers this part so vividly? I love that part where he's got that nickel in his pocket. She places it up there. He doesn't tell her he doesn't have enough money. He places the orange on the counter with the nickel. That really is kind of the climax for me of this narrative poem. It also brings me to this part where Gary Soto uses some great word choice, but then he really is pretty simple here. He sets the nickel on the counter and one of the oranges, and it says, when I looked up, the lady's eyes met mine, the sales lady, and held them, knowing very well what it was all about. So he just says it there, and as the reader, we have to fill in what it is. It is that he's with this girl. It's their first date. He doesn't have enough money, and the sales lady knows exactly what's going on here and what would happen if she says that's not enough money, but instead, she just knows what it's all about. Question number 3 for us is, what type of figurative language is here? This is when they're staring at the candies, and it says, I turned to the candies tiered like bleachers. What type of figurative language is tiered like bleachers? All right, let's go ahead and do the last section. Outside, a few cars hissing past, fog hanging like old coats between the trees. I took my girl's hand and mine for 2 blocks, then released it to let her unwrap the chocolate. I peeled my orange that was so bright against the gray of December that from some distance Someone might have thought I was making a fire in my hands. So in that introduction screencast that I did, I mentioned juxtaposition. And here's an example where they go outside, they leave the store, and these cars are hissing past, kind of going by fast. Everybody's in a hurry, but not him. Him and the girl are just going to go sit down and enjoy their chocolate and orange. And we have the cars are hissing past, but then fog is hanging like an old coat. Love that line. But we have juxtaposition. The cars, everybody else is moving fast, but the fog is just hanging there. So we have this kind of opposites. And that isn't the first time the author used opposites. We have opposites at the beginning of the story where he doesn't have a girlfriend. He's nervous. And then here it says, I took my girl's hand. It's almost like there's been this big change in their relationship. It talks about old cars in the first few lines. And right after that, it talks about new trees. It's dark outside, it's gloomy, it's foggy, it's wintertime, but then the author keeps using the word light several times. The girl has a light kind of in her eyes or her smile. There's a light on in that store. So the author's using this juxtaposition. He's nervous. Now he takes her hand. He is becoming confident. So there's some really good examples of juxtaposition. And then Gary Soto brings that in at the end, I think, where the very beginning of the poem mentions the setting, it's December, it's cold. He repeats that here, but here we have juxtaposition that was so bright against the gray December. And he has the very end, this line that if someone saw that orange, they would think that maybe it was a fire in his hand. So again, a very different feeling than that cold to that warmth, that fire. Very good juxtaposition that he uses that wraps up the story. The last two questions I have for you is what type of figurative language is being used in line 44? A few cars hissing past. And then question number 5, what type of figurative language is being used in lines 45 and 46? The fog is hanging like old coats between the trees. So I hope you enjoyed this poem. It is one of my favorites. I could talk for a lot longer about the meaning and some of the things in the poem, but maybe we'll do that together as a class, whether we do that in person or whether we do that as a Google Meet. That might be kind of nice. So hope you enjoyed the poem. Go ahead and answer those questions and make your way over to the other assignment. Have a great day, everybody.